Good morning, everyone. I'm here to let you know that all of this discussion about trade conflicts and the end of the global order, that it's a bunch of crap and we're all going to be just fine when this is all over. And that's an utter lie. Folks, it's all going straight to hell. But before we talk about the end of the world, let's remind ourselves what the beginning looked like. This is how we used to trade. We did not trade goods, we traded ammo. And if you saw something you thought you would need, you went out and you took it, you confiscated it, you expanded into empires. Some empires were better at this than others. And at the end of that system, we got World War II, which brought the entire network crashing down. At war's end, it was up to the Americans, really the last men standing, to figure out what's next. So they drew their allies together, they held a conference, and they laid out the rules for a new age. The American Navy would provide security for what was now the global commons and allow anyone to go anywhere, pick up any raw commodity, ship it home, metabolize it into a finished good, and then re-export it for hard currency. In addition, the Americans would provide absolute security for all members. And it gave us this map. The deep blue were the countries the Americans cared about before World War II. The medium blue were the new partners in this new global order. The orange are the other guys. Americans don't like talking about them. And light blue is the field of competition. It was a global fight with global consequences, and the United States could never deny battle. But then one idle Tuesday, in the very definition of pent-up demand, the Germans threw a party, and it was over. And it had never occurred to the Americans that the global system could go anywhere except for the logical endpoint of nuclear annihilation. We had no plan for what was going to happen the next day, and the map changed. And there's a lot of gray up there, a lot of places the Americans don't have a firm opinion on. Now, the person who was in charge at this moment of transition back in 1989 was George Herbert Walker Bush. From a foreign policy point of view, by far the most skilled president the United States has ever had. He worked with the CIA, he was vice president, Office of Budget, ambassador to China, served in the House of Representatives. He had excellent relations with every world leader who mattered, and personal relationships with everyone across the American political spectrum. He was the right person at the right time, in the right place, in the right job, with the right contact list and the right disposition, so of course Americans voted him out of office. And we started down the parade of morons. Bill Clinton was arguably the smartest president the United States has had since Jefferson himself, but he had an attention deficit issue. He also saw himself as a domestic leader, wasn't interested in foreign affairs. And so when he realized that he had a summit the next day, he would kind of hunker down with the State Department and CIA desk officers and cram for the test the next morning like he was a millennial before his time. And frustratingly, he would hit it out of the park every time, but there would be no follow-up. So for the 8 years of the Clinton administration, we really only had about 2 months of foreign policy. Then we had W, call it what it was. We had a monochromatic foreign policy that dealt with one issue in one region to the exclusion of everything else. Barack Obama came in. Now, Obama was kind of a strange cat by American standards. He demonstrated in his final 6 months as president, in a series of kind of exit interviews with the media, a command of the details and the context of foreign affairs that I've never seen out of an American elected leader. But he had this weird personality quirk. He hated people. And no American president met with his own cabinet secretaries fewer times or went to Capitol Hill fewer times than Barack Obama. So for 8 years, we had no foreign policy at all. There is more going on here than Donald Trump simply being the fourth moron. The glory, the horror of Donald Trump is that at his core, he has a really good point. The global order the Americans created in the 1940s no longer serves American strategic interests. But economically, it was never supposed to. The Americans create an environment that subsidizes the alliance to fight the Soviets but it doesn't use that for its own economic purposes, because then it wouldn't be a bribe. I could give you 1,000 reasons why the United States will be just fine without the global structures that we've all become used to, but really, you only need one. The United States is not a trading nation. And as long as that is the case, as long as the United States is the country on this planet with the lowest involvement as a percentage of GDP in international commerce, it can go its own way. And it is. A couple other points to throw in there. Let's talk demography. Now, this is a standard demographic profile. We've got children at the bottom, young adults, mature adults, retirees at the top, men on one side, women on the other. This is Mexico. This is a consumption-led demography. Because whenever the bulge in your structure is below roughly age 40, it's all about the spending, kids, cars, college, homes. When American policymakers look at a country like Mexico, we don't see a competitor. All of the low value-added jobs in the United States left back in the 60s and 70s. This is a complementary system. Mexico does the lower-end manufacturing, it does the assembly, the United States does the design work. Trade goes back and forth. You may have noticed that the Trump administration stopped yelling at Mexico about trade about 2 years ago. They've moved on to other issues. This is a country that the United States can integrate with. This is not. Canada is a mature demography. It's no longer consumption-led. It has a lot of people aged 40 to 65. These people aren't doing a lot of spending. They're doing a lot of investing. They're preparing for retirement. But you take a market like this with a super saturated mature worker bloc, and they can compete in international markets at below average labor costs for that skill set. But they don't have enough people in the 20s and the 30s to absorb what those people produced. They must export the difference. One of the reasons the Trump administration came down so hard on Canada in trade talks is they were willing to admit that Canada has become the competitive system to the American market, but yet it can't survive without the American market. Now, if your aging can't get reined in, eventually you turn into something like Japan. How do you run a first world economy without a first world workforce? Well, fun fact, robots. Since they don't vote yet, it doesn't matter where you put them. So the Japanese have become exports not in outsourcing or in resourcing, but in desourcing, picking up entire chunks of their industrial plant and dropping it down into other countries to get on the right side of currency and political risk. It's working for them. Here's the US. The US is kind of in the middle. There's two bulges in here we need to kind of kick around a little bit. First, at the top, you've got the baby boomers, which are the largest generation as a percentage of the population in American history. And that bulge and that capital-rich demographic has made the United States capital-rich, unprecedentedly capital-rich, exorbitantly capital-rich, perhaps a little too capital-rich. Because all those boomers and that capital-rich demographic trying to get ready for retirement have pushed down their cost of capital, pushed down the rate of return. This is why we're all here, right? You're trying to find that mythical extra 1% of return. So is the entire baby boomer cadre. But in just 3 years, those baby movers move from net contributors to the investment network to net takers because they all move into retirement. Think about how it works. When you're 35, you have a small income, and a small sliver of that small income is put away into savings. When you're 55, it's a bigger pie, and you put a big fat wedge of it away. And when you're 64 3/4, you probably put as much as you possibly can. And then you retire, and you never add to it again. Cheaper, more available, easier terms on capital, and then all of a sudden, nothing. The year 2022 is the year that the majority of the boomers move into retirement, which means that the cost of capital in that year will at least quadruple. Next block down that matters, the millennials. This is normally where I would like to spend about 20 minutes talking about why the millennials are a waste of skin, but we don't have that kind of time. So instead, we're going to talk about all the reasons that we should all be grateful for the millennials. This won't take nearly as long because there's only 3 reasons. So, number 1, consumption. All of those juice bar memberships and that filet mignon dog food and that fat-free, sugar-free, gluten-free, cruelty-free beard butter, and all those goddamn scooters, it all adds up. Millennial consumption has kept the United States out of recession since 2009. The US probably would have had 3 recessions since then otherwise. And they're young enough and there's enough of them that consumption pulse has another 4 years left to run. That's fantastic. Second, if you fast forward to the year 2030, when the millennials are in charge of the United States, and I cry inside a little thinking about that, they can fill out the tax-paying class in a way that the Gen X never could. So everything you've heard about the fiscal cliff and the coming financial calamity, totally true. Pay attention to that. The snake swallowing the watermelon, it's real. But there is a light at the end of the tunnel. It's a millennial, which also makes me cry a little inside. But if you look at the rest of the rich world without the Americans, there really aren't all that many millennials. This isn't a snake swallowing a watermelon, this is a snake swallowing a freight train. And most countries in the Western world and in East Asia are already past the point of no return demographically. That is enough to kill most countries, even if the Americans remain involved. So let's talk capital. This is the private capital curve, total private capital into the United States since 2000. That spike in the middle, that's the subprime crisis. The US experienced a doubling of private capital in 7 years. That was too much too fast. We had a recession, knocked 5% of GDP off in 18 months. Since then, the US has been growing at a much more sustainable rate, much closer to the century average. That's a doubling. Same data, relative terms. The little hump in the middle is a double. Here's the Eurozone. The Europeans had a tripling in the time the Americans had a doubling. As a result, their financial crisis hit harder, lasted longer. Italy still has not recovered. That's Greece. 7-fold increase in 7 years. They so far have had a 40% reduction in GDP. That's worse than the Great Depression, and they are not done. Here's Brazil. Not as bad as Greece, but still not great. This is what a lost decade looks like. And that assumes they get the politics right. Spoiler alert, they're not. I don't know how many of you follow Brazilian politics. I find it delightful. They had a presidential election last year in which the 2 final candidates, one was campaigning from prison where he had been convicted of corruption, not indicted, convicted. You can still run. And the other dude at one of his final public rallies said that the real problem with the Nazis is that they were just far too soft on their domestic foes. Why don't we go ahead and pencil in a second lost decade for Brazil? Here's India and Turkey. 2 countries who have already elected ethno-nationalist leaders who don't think twice about spawning race riots that kill a couple hundred people a pop when they feel it serves their tactical political purposes. They have yet to begin their credit adjustment. And then here's the People's Republic of China. Let me bring that down for you. Yeah, China is now the most overcredited country in human history in both absolute and relative terms. You've all heard about the tightening they've done the last few months. That's that little bit of a fallback at the top. Yeah, that's not going to end well, folks. And at this time of transition, who has the guns really matters. Now, on the right, you've got a traditional jump carrier. On the left, you have a super. In the deep blue sea, it takes 7 jump carriers to stand up to 1 super. There are 21 jump carriers in the world. 11 are American. There are 11 super carriers in the world. All are American. At current rates of global naval buildout, the combined navies of the rest of the planet will roughly equal American naval power in the year 2240. As an American, I don't lose a lot of sleep over this. But consider this. The United States is the only country that can theoretically support something like the global order. And now it's a country that retains the capacity to kick in any door on the planet whenever it wants, and not care about what happens the next day. The United States is shifting from the greatest source of stability to the greatest source of disruption, but it doesn't have a policy to guide that at present. So let's run through what's going on in trade. 4 big issues going on. First of all, energy. The United States will become a net exporter of every source of energy product by the end of this year. And the cost of producing in the American shale fields will be below Saudi Arabia by the end of next year, which means that the Americans look at energy markets differently. It used to be that stability was good to keep the markets in place, which was good for the American consumer. That relationship no longer holds. All of a sudden, deliberate disruption in energy markets is good for American business because the US president does not require approval from Congress to allow or disallow crude exports. I strongly suggest you look at what's going on in Venezuela and Iran in that light. Disruption is now good for American business. Next up, steel and aluminum tariffs, automotive tariffs. You may have noticed that the Trump administration has not withdrawn any of the tariffs in those categories that it has imposed, even when it finally gets a new trade deal. They are being held in reserve as hammers to force cooperation on whatever the issue of the day happens to be. It's the global order in reverse. It used to be that the United States would sacrifice economic access in order to achieve security preeminence. Now the United States is acting almost neo-imperially when it comes to trade talks and holding these tools back for whatever it needs at any given moment, ally or enemy. And then finally, there's currency markets. This is a pretty savvy crowd. I don't have to go into the guts of this, but let me kind of break down real fast. There's a 3-step process in currency trade and manufacturers trade. If you are, say, Argentina and you're selling a load of goods to Thailand, you don't get paid in Thai baht because no one in Argentina has or wants baht. And you don't get paid in pesos because nobody in Thailand has or wants pesos. So the Thais pay in their own currency, it's exchanged for the US dollar, and then it's re-exchanged for pesos. 3-step process. Under Barack Obama, the United States inserted itself into that middle step so it could allow or deny individual transactions based on what was going on in Iran. The Trump administration has taken those tools and amped them up so it can allow or deny all transactions from the bank or even country of choice. This does not simply deny that entity access to the American market, but to all global trade. And since the United States isn't a trading nation, the impact on the American consumer is minimal. The guy using these tools is Robert Lighthizer. He is the only person in the Trump administration who has been there from the beginning and the only one with any sort of autonomy. Now, Lighthizer is kind of infamous in American circles for not giving interviews. And this is not his first stint in government. He used to work for Reagan. You guys remember the Plaza Accords? When the United States basically bludgeoned the European and Japanese allies into forcibly devaluing the US dollar? This is the guy who was assigned to Japan in the aftermath to make sure they never reneged. And whenever he got his marching orders from the White House, he'd walk into the Japanese Ministry of Finance, lay out the American position, and when the Japanese issued their rebuttal, he would take off his translator microphone, take it apart, have a little G.I. Joe war with the pieces on the desk while the Japanese spoke. And when they were done, put it back together, put it on, and say, well, that was riveting, but we're going to do it my way, right? This is the guy in charge of the trade talks. This is the guy who's hosting the Chinese in Washington right now. So let's go through the trade talks. First up with the Koreans. At his first opportunity, President Moon of South Korea walked into the Oval Office and said, there is no version of a future without America in the world where my country survives. So you want to renegotiate the Chorus trade deal? Fine. What do you want? We will cave on everything. Didn't have a choice. Now, was that enough? Is this new deal enough to make sure that when the rubber hits the road, the Americans will be there? President Moon doesn't know. Donald Trump doesn't know. No one knows. But I can guarantee you, without that trade deal, there would have been no chance at all. Next up was Mexico. Now, the guy on the right, that is Manuel Obrador. He is kind of the combination of the blind ideology of Jaroslaw Kaczynski of Poland with the ego of Emmanuel Macron of France, with the body of Angela Merkel of Germany, the organizational skills of any random Italian, and the math command of Jeremy Corbyn. all in one dude. And when he became president, he was elected in a landslide, and everyone was convinced that there was going to be a pissing match between him and Donald Trump, because they're both nationalists. But ironically, therein lied the opportunity. Obrador was smart enough to know that if he picked a fight, that would define his presidency. So he reached out to his predecessor and to Trump and said that if you two guys can figure out what's next, what NAFTA 2 happens to be, I'll get it ratified. So far, he's been a man of his word. Where are my Canadians? Wow, security here sucks. This is Christina Freeland. In my opinion, she's one of the 10 smartest people Western civilization has ever produced. She is currently the Foreign Minister of Canada. 3 years ago, I beat her in a debate. She's Foreign Minister. Let's call that a wash. She knew 5 minutes into her first meeting with the American leader that she was the wrong person for the job. Trump has this weird personality quirk where he feels he has to be the smartest person in the room, and with her in the same zip code, that was never going to happen. So she knew that she needed someone to put in front with a tight outfit and great hair and a nice smile, who just nod and smile and never open their damn mouth, and she found the perfect person. Justin Trudeau is by far Donald Trump's favorite leader, because he just stands to the side and does a lot of this. The Canadians call it the hug offensive, and it was working gloriously until Canada had the honor of hosting the G7 summit last summer. And for the first time, as host, Trudeau had to speak, and the internal monologue that Trump had been using to fill in the gaps that was all very complimentary did not match what he was hearing. And relations literally fell apart in an hour. When Lighthizer came back from Mexico and called up to Canada and said, we've got a bilateral deal with the Mexicans, you have 7 days to accept our terms, the Canadians caved in 6. Why did they hold out for so long and then cave so quickly? Well, it has to do with this map. This is how Canada has always seen itself in the world, or at least since 1945. Canada is on the flight path for the intercontinental ballistic missiles that would fly from the Soviet Union to the United States. So there was never, ever a version of American security in the Cold War that did not reflexively also protect Canada. The Canadians could have been security free riders. To their credit, they were not. They were always the first ones there to help, but that doesn't mean they didn't use their leverage somewhere else. So whenever there was a security crisis, the Canadian PM would call up the American president, commit forces, and say, oh, by the way, we could really enjoy some extra access to your market for Quebecois cheese. And all of these incidental concessions were rounded up and put into the original NAFTA accord. They were all removed from NAFTA 2. And because the Trump administration sees Canada as more of a competitor and Mexico as more of a partner, they had no choice about that. Their environment has changed, and now their trade relationship has as well. Shinzo Abe thought he had a deal. He was the second world leader to visit Trump post-inauguration, and they hit it off splendidly. They had a series of agreements on security cooperation, intelligence sharing. Abe went home thinking everything was great, and then 6 months later, Donald Trump leveled steel and aluminum tariffs. Abe comes back to Washington, wondering what's going on. He says, I thought we had a deal. You were going to be in front with the carriers. The Japanese and all the Asian allies were going to be behind you. We're going to face down the Chinese together. You were going to pay for it all. And Trump's like, oh, no, I see why you got confused. Guns for butter. That was the old global order structure. Yeah, no, we don't do that anymore. We will use every tool we have to force whatever end result we want on a tactical issue. And don't go calling up the Australians and the Koreans and try to build some sort of multilateral framework to hem us in. We don't do that anymore. So Abe went home, reread The Art of the Deal, was convinced that this was all a negotiating ploy, and he called up the Koreans and the Australians and tried to build a multilateral net. And then all of a sudden, Donald Trump announces the deal with Korea, and with Mexico, and with Canada, and Abe realizes that 3 of Japan's 4 largest trading partners had already rearranged themselves into a post-order network, and the last country was China. He caved. Those talks will probably finish up later this summer. We all complain about our jobs way too much. Let me start with the punchline. There is no version of Brexit that will lead anywhere other than a hard divorce. European policymaking gives every individual country a full veto on the important stuff. Brexit is an important thing. There's no version of the deal that will satisfy Ireland and Spain and Germany and the Netherlands and France. This was always going to be a hard crash out. Now, if you're like me and you think that the EU is ultimately unsustainable, there's an argument to be made that leaving and starting on what's next, getting a head start, makes a lot of sense. But that's not what the United Kingdom is doing. The United Kingdom is trapped in this never-ending Brextension process where it still has all the costs and restrictions of the EU, but the benefits are leaking away, especially the ability to negotiate from a position of strength with anyone in the outside world, anyone beyond Europe, about what's next. Now, Britain has been here before. Quick war story. In World War II, not World War II, World War I, the Americans, as we tend to be, were late to the game. And when we finally got involved, we didn't have a Navy. Kind of a problem. So we floated these guys, the Town class. By far the crappiest vessels that have ever served in the US Navy. Some of them actually were taking on water while they were still in dry dock, which should not be possible. When they would sail by a British vessel in the North Atlantic, the British sailors would get up on deck and take bets as to whether or not the American vessel would have to call for assistance because it broke down. Luckily, they did not see a lot of combat. And at the war's end, we brought them all back to the States, put tarps over them, forgot that they ever existed because it was just humiliating. World War II rolls around. We're late to that party too. And Churchill calls up FDR and says, hey, if you're not going to get in this fight, at least give us some equipment. And FDR is like, well, we have the Town class. After having a minor stroke, Churchill says, thank you. And on his way out the door, FDR's like, oh, no. Those aren't free. As payment, we will take every single military facility you have in the Western Hemisphere. And 3 centuries of imperial expansion unwound in a day. What the Trump administration is going to do to Britain will be at least that harsh. And at a minimum, it will cost the United Kingdom the financial district in London. Americans love to stress about China. I don't. Those islands off the coast, Japan, Taiwan, the Philippines, Indonesia, the Chinese call it the first island chain. They have always barred Chinese commercial involvement with the rest of the planet. Commercial transport requires open, free seas where anyone can sail at any time on any schedule with any change whenever they want for any reason. That has never been possible in Chinese history with the exception of under the global order when everyone was on the same side. There is no version of a world without America in which China continues to exist as a mercantile power. Its navy may have a lot of ships, but only 30 of them have the capacity to sail more than 1,000 kilometers from shore. It is not a regional naval power, much less a global naval power. And President Xi knows it. And they can't become consumption-led. Remember the one-child policy? Well, shocker, 30 years after the one-child policy, they are running out of 25-year-olds. The Chinese are not nearly as good at math as they would have the rest of the world believe. And so when President Xi finally had his first summit with Donald Trump, he called ahead and said that he did not want to meet in the White House. He had some things he needed to say in private. So they went to Mar-a-Lago where Trump could control the environment. And Xi's like, you control everything that matters in this relationship. Trade access, maritime access, the energy markets, the financial markets. There is no version of my country being successful or safe or secure or united that does not involve some degree of American largesse. So let's talk about North Korea and cybercrime and the South China Sea, even Taiwan. Let's talk about it all. And the US and China made more progress in bilateral relations in the next 11 months than we had in the previous 20 years. It wasn't enough. And now it's falling apart. But it's interesting. Xi felt he had to tip his hand and share that the greatest threats to his personal security, his country's security, are completely at the mercy of the even-keeled nature of the man on the left. Ouch. And best part, Lighthizer is in charge of the trade talks. The tripling of sanctions last Friday were his idea. The tripling of sanctions in another month are also his idea. He's the one driving this boat, and Trump loves it. All right, we're going to fly through Europe real quick, because if there is one world leader who does not understand Donald Trump, it is Angela Merkel. She came to Washington with a history lesson, thinking she could just explain to Donald Trump how Europe works, and that would do it. And he stopped her about a fifth of the way into it. She actually brought maps and charts and everything. It was delightful. There's so many things I could say about the European system, but it really comes down to this. Europe is an export union. Peace in Europe, a whole Europe, a free Europe, is dependent on the American security commitment. And without that, Europe loses its ability to export. You can see it in the demographics, why that's essential. Consumption-led growth, a recovery in the periphery is now flat out impossible. There aren't enough young people. But the same is true in the core. Now, as long as the global system persists, Germany's in the sweet spot. Lots of high-value added workers. As long as they have access to an end market, they're okay. But you remove that market and it goes away, and in 10 years that bulge moves into mass retirement. This was never going to last. And if you're looking for what might be the proximate cause, assuming it's not the Americans, I strongly suggest you look at the banking sector. This is non-performing loans, loans that have gone bad. Now, in the United States, if your loan stack hits about 5% of your total, our Federal Deposit Insurance Corp comes in, closes the institution down, breaks up the assets, redistributes them. 5%. Now, those countries in yellow are Eurozone countries, and this is Italy. Here's the best part. Italy and the United States define an NPL differently. In the US, if you're 31 days late, you're in arrears, and if you're 91 days late, you go into foreclosure. NPL in the US, 91 days. In Italy, if you are 271 days late, but you have made a partial payment, you're still in good standing. That uses that definition, which means in relative terms, the Italian bad loan stack is 80 times what it was in the United States at the height of subprime. I'm not saying you shouldn't worry about Russia or the migrant crisis or the euro or consumption or demography. All of those are real concerns. All of those are system killers. But this one could kill Europe tomorrow. And there is not enough money on the planet to bail out this system. All right, I am over time. If you're looking for a coaster or maybe a doorstop, a couple suggestions there, and then this bad boy comes out in January. So thank you very much. You laughed at every joke. Sometimes that's a little touch and go, so I appreciate that. And we've got some Q&A, right?
Absolutely,
all right.
Yes. Well, thank you very much indeed, Peter, for that very bracing and somewhat chilling quick tour of the world, or the disunited nations. And as someone who has spent a lot of time recently in Washington, I've been into the Oval Office and interviewed Donald Trump. I've spoken to most of the people in those pictures, apart from Lighthizer, who indeed is the only person in Washington who never meets the media. I can say that what you've said rings very, very true indeed. But what I find fascinating is that we've had lots of questions from you. Thank you, keep them flooding in. And by far and away, the questions which are attracting the most interest out of these almost 24 questions are all to do not with Trump, but China.
Sure.
So you are mostly concerned, judging from this, with China. So let's start with some of these questions, and there are many of them which are very, very, okay, the one that has the most interest of all is this. What precipitates China's credit adjustment?
The smart thing to do would be what the Chinese have been trying to do ever since Xi came to power, and steadily rein in the credit volume. But every time that happens, they see a very sharp contraction in economic growth that they find to be politically unsustainable. Remember that the people who are in the Politburo right now and who have been in the Politburo for the last several decades, they got their jobs by organizing large numbers of unemployed people and marching on the government. So they want to make sure that that never happens. So I would argue that fixing this in a slow motion deflationary, not deflationary, but like deflating the bubble, I think that ship sailed 20 years ago. And so the question becomes, is this triggering going to be internal or external? Let's start with internal. Demographically, we are going to be seeing a contraction in Chinese domestic economic activity simply because of demographics within the next 5 years. We're already at the peak right now for what that market is able to sustain. And so that would be more than enough to take what has been a disinflationary environment and turn it into a Japanese-style deflationary environment, which has all the effects for everything from asset prices to political stability that you guys have come to understand. Externally, wow. If the Russians move any faster, you get an energy crisis. If the Saudis and the Iranians go at it, you get an energy crisis. If the Japanese take advantage of their new trade deal with the Americans and try to reassert control, you get an access crisis. If the United States decides to change the rules of the game, you can pick your crisis. There are so many things that the Chinese are dependent upon the external environment for that they have no influence over. It's a little bit like Europe in that there's so many guns pointed at China's head right now, it really doesn't matter who pulls the trigger first.
Okay, well, I must say, having spent a lot of my career in Japan, what's happening in China in many ways with the credit bubble looks so similar to what happened in Japan in the 1980s. It's like almost exactly the same playbook, which is not reassuring. But here's another extremely popular question. What is the role of China? Is it a disruptor or a coordinator to construct the new world order?
The Chinese economy is based on mass imports of raw materials and mass exports of finished goods. That means it cannot impose itself as a replacer to the United States in any sort of nouveau order. It could theoretically be the first of the new empires, but to do that, it needs to flat out subjugate the first island chain, and that includes Japan. I don't think that is within their capacity, even if they thought they might be able to have kind of a Hail Mary chance. The best option for China is the one that President Xi has been preparing them for, lockdown. The anti-corruption effort of his first 5-year term was not really designed to root out corruption. Any of you who have been doing business in China can understand how endemic that is. But it was to make sure that there were no powers on a regional basis that were sufficiently potent that they might be able to stand up to him once he starts tightening the screws. Because if the Chinese Politburo has to choose between a China that retains links to the international system but risks spinning apart, or one that closes itself off and becomes much poorer but can hold together. I mean, there's not a discussion to be held in China on that topic. Holding the center is what all of this has always been about. China's got 3,000 years of history, but it's only actually been a unified entity for about 1/10 of that. Half of that was under the Mongol occupation, and the other half is under the American-led order. If they can hold on to a fraction of what they have right now and remain a unified country, for them, that's a win.
Right. And one more question about China, because as I say, it's extremely interesting to poll what you guys care about, and China is leading the pack by a very, very, very long way in terms of popularity of questions. This is the most popular question of all, and I would not have predicted it. Isn't China disrupting the world's order by financing investments in Africa and other places? Is it that we are not, quote, seeing it because their approach is different from the Western world's approach?
It's not an approach issue, it's a volume issue and a rationale issue. You guys remember back in the 1980s when the Japanese bought Rockefeller Center for $3 billion, even though it was only worth $1 billion? And then 6 months later, they sold it for like $1.5 billion?
Yeah, no, I wrote a book about it.
They were thrilled because they got half their money out. This is capital flight. Think about what drives the Chinese system: overcapitalization, a bottomless supply of endless loans at below market prices. Now, in the 1990s, this generated a huge volume of overproduction in cement and steel and other bits of construction, and China needed it then because it needed the roads and the rail networks. But by the time you got to 2000, they had supersaturated internal Chinese demand. So they dumped the products on the international market. One of the reasons why the steel industry and the rest of the world is in such shambles is because of this policy. But by the time you got to 2010, Chinese overproduction had supersaturated global demand. There was no place else for it to go. So the Chinese went out with One Belt, One Road and started building ports in countries that no one would ever go to, and building roads to countries nobody wanted to visit, and building rail lines to countries that had no consumer market. So, yes, there is a rail line from China to Kabul, and what does the winner get? This is product disposal, or to a slightly lesser degree, it's purchasing friends in out-of-the-way places, kind of like what the Russians did in the 1990s. But as the Russians discovered, as soon as you stop paying people to be your friends, they are no longer your friends.
Well, moving from China, we have another question which has suddenly exploded in popularity in the last couple of minutes, which, needless to say, concerns London. Question: please will you expand on your statement regarding the demise of London as a dominant financial centre, to which I'd add, particularly given that we're sitting here and probably many of you depend on your jobs on it.
London's advantage...
So cheer them up if you can.
Sure. I can't. London's advantage, the reason that London is a global financial hub is twofold. Number one, friendly business environment, very regular, very reliable, everyone knows the rules of the game. Second, they're in the European Union, so London has become the first stop for capital flight from the Eurozone to the wider world. With Brexit, all of that leaves. The Brextension process means that the reliability, the knowledge that the rules are going to be the same day to day, that is gone. And we've already seen the change in the pound and the change in dispositions of all the banks adjust because of that. That's nothing compared to what's happening the day after Brexit. But more importantly, if you're like me and you think that the Eurozone ultimately is going to implode, all that money is going to leave, and London is no longer the logical first stop because it's not within the system, it's no longer affiliated with the system, and it doesn't have the reliability that we've normally associated with London. There are limited places in the rest of the world. Sydney, New York, maybe even a little bit in Auckland, Singapore, Hong Kong, there are other places it can go. Switzerland, but it tends to be constrained, and I wouldn't bet on Switzerland. Because if this is because the European system is crashing, Switzerland doesn't look nearly as good. So you've got two fires. On the European side, there is a desire to claw as much of this as possible back. And on the American side, this is a shiny thing that the United Kingdom has that they're going to want as part of a trade deal. Now, the Americans are going to get their piece. The Europeans will get a little. But every time that the Europeans have floated the idea that they're going to force clearing on Euro issues into the Eurozone, the Federal Reserve calls them up, is like, it's totally legal for you to do that. You do whatever you think is right, but just so you know that if you force Euro clearing to be in the Eurozone, we will force dollar clearing to be in the dollar zone. And more trade within Europe is done in dollars than it is done in euros, much less beyond. Yeah. And so that tends to get knocked down pretty quick. And it's the policymakers don't talk about that. It tends to be more the talking heads. So I would expect at the end of all of this that the London financial sector is going to shrink by about 3/4, with 1/4 of it going to Europe and the other half going to New York.
Wow. Okay, well, so let's try and be cheerful about something else. Actually, before we move on, quickly on that issue, why are you so negative on the US impact on the UK? What motivates the US to want to crush the UK? Aren't we supposed to have this wonderful special relationship?
Yeah, first, this is how we treat family. Imagine how we treat countries we don't like. So, the Canadians always had a special place in the American mind, and we saw how much that was worth. A couple things to keep in mind when you're talking about bilateral relations across the pond. As long as security and economic access is going to be first and foremost in the British mind, that gives the United States all the leverage, specifically since you didn't just cut the cord. Had Britain cut the cord and just left, they would have a lot more leverage in figuring out what's next. Just kind of dragging it on is a big problem. Second, and this is more an American hang-up, there are only 3 countries in American history that have ever threatened the mainland. Mexico, we defeated in 2 wars and forced into a subordinate economic position that we will never let them out of. The Soviet Union threatened us with nukes, and so we took a certain amount of glee in the 1990s when we turned the screws, and we will never admit them back into any version of a system that we run. And the third country is the United Kingdom.
Wow. Donald Trump, got to ask the question.
Sure.
Will he be, and this is a summarizing questions, is he going to be re-elected?
Odds are, I'd say 90% yes. So what's going on in American politics right now, we've got 37 Democrats that have declared for the presidency. By this time in August, I would expect every single Democrat will be running for president, which means that all the Democrats are arguing over who the real Democrat is.
Right.
So we've got Senator Warren and Sanders, who are our version of socialists, which are nothing like your version of socialists, who are arguing over who's worse at math.
Right.
And when we finally get to the conventions in March, whoever wins in this blood-spattered melee isn't going to have a party behind them.
Right. Well, I agree.
On the Republican side, the business conservatives, national security conservatives, and fiscal conservatives, these are the people that Donald Trump considers to be his true ideological foes, more so than the Democrats. And in the midterms just finished, he was successful in ejecting them wholesale from both his administration and from Congress. So he now controls the Republican Party, or what's left of it. I expect those three factions, business, fiscal, national security, to get behind a unity candidate to try to take their party back. But I think we're too late for that. I think they'll fail, which means that Trump walks away with it.
I must say I agree. Last question. Given this rather dystopian vision that you have sketched out, I think for the audience here, probably quite a frightening vision, irrespective of whether you want to build your career in London or not. Is it time to stock up on gold? Do you own gold?
No, I do not. I don't own a speck of it.
Would you tell the audience to own gold as the one thing that they would have?
I see gold as one of the most distorting markets out there. And remember, the only thing that allows gold to exist as a method of financial exchange is the global structure. And if the global structure goes away, you can't eat gold. And the question is whether the domicile that you live in will use it, allow it, as a method of goods exchange. And if the answer to that is no, then you're looking for hard currency. There's only 6 in the world. The pound is the second largest. And so you are in for a roller coaster ride, but there are far worse places to be.
Well, given that we're sitting in a sterling-based region, that at least is a source of some encouragement. Good luck, and thank you very much.